You carried the dish with both hands because your mother told you if you dropped it in the parking lot, God Himself would not forgive you. That was Sunday after Mass in parishes from El Paso to East Los Angeles, when the folding tables came out and every woman in the congregation tried to outdo the one who brought the best cazuela last week. Nobody at number 13 wanted to say what part of the cow was in the pot, but everyone wanted a second bowl. The cactus paddles at number 19 cleared half the room and brought the other half back for seconds. And the meat at number 9 came from a cut. Most grocery stores today will not even carry. Those tables are harder to find now, so hit subscribe because these potluck dishes are worth remembering. Here are 25 forgotten Mexican church potluck dishes no one makes anymore. Number 25. Rajas con crema. Strips of roasted poblano pepper cooked down in cream with corn kernels and a little onion. The peppers were charred over an open flame, peeled by hand, and sliced into thin ribbons that curled in the skillet like dark green streamers. The cream sauce was not heavy. It was thin enough to pour over rice, but rich enough to make a tortilla worth filling. At church potlucks, this showed up in shallow casserole dishes, and it went with everything on the table. People spooned it over enchiladas, over tamales, over plain beans. The younger women stopped making it when sour cream dips from the grocery store started appearing at gatherings instead. The original needed fresh peppers roasted that morning and real cream from the dairy case, and the shortcut versions never tasted the same. Number 24. Entomatadas. Corn tortillas dipped in a cooked tomato sauce, folded into quarters, and laid in rows in a baking dish with crumbled queso fresco and sliced onion on top. They were the quiet cousin of enchiladas, less showy but easier to make in bulk. The sauce was simple: tomatoes, garlic, a dried chile or two, all blended and fried in a little oil until it darkened. The tortillas soaked it up without falling apart if the cook worked fast. Parish women made trays of 50 at a time, lining them up like tiles. There was no meat, which made them cheap and appropriate for Lenten Fridays. They sat on the table between the heavier dishes and nobody talked about them, but the tray always came home empty. That was enough. Number 23. Tinga de pollo. Shredded chicken cooked in a sauce of chipotle peppers, tomatoes, and sliced onion until the whole pot turned a smoky rust color. The chipotles gave it a heat that built slowly. Not the sharp sting of a raw jalapeno, but a low burn that lingered at the back of the throat. At church tables, the tinga was set out with a stack of tostadas beside it. People piled the chicken onto the crisp, flat tortillas and ate them standing up because there were never enough chairs in the parish hall. Some women added a smear of refried beans underneath the chicken as a base. The dish fell out of regular rotation when families stopped making their own chipotle adobo from scratch and relied on the canned version, which carried a different sharpness that none of the older women recognized as their own. Number 22. Chicharrones en salsa verde. Dried pork rinds broken into rough pieces and simmered in a tart green tomatillo sauce until they softened and absorbed the liquid like bread in soup. The texture was nothing like the crunchy chicharrones sold in bags at gas stations. These were soft, almost spongy, and they carried the flavor of the salsa verde deep into every bite. In parishes across South Texas, this was a weekday staple that graduated to potluck tables during Lent when the rules about meat got complicated. Pork skin was not considered meat in many families' interpretation, so the dish walked a line that satisfied both tradition and appetite. It disappeared from church gatherings as store-bought chicharrones replaced the thick, home-rendered kind that neighborhood butchers used to sell by the slab. Number 21. Papas con rajas. Cubed potatoes fried with strips of roasted poblano and onion, served with a little cream stirred in at the end. This was the dish that teenage daughters learned to cook first because the ingredients were cheap and the technique was forgiving. At potlucks, it showed up in cast iron skillets still sizzling from the stove. The potatoes had crispy edges and soft centers, and the roasted pepper gave them a smoky sweetness that plain fried potatoes could never match. People ate it as a side or rolled it into a tortilla and called it lunch. The dish needed fresh poblanos roasted over a flame, and when families stopped keeping a gas stove or an open burner, the whole recipe lost its starting point. Number 20. Flautas de pollo. Corn tortillas rolled tight around shredded chicken and fried until they cracked when you bit into them. The name meant flutes, and they looked like it. Long and narrow and golden brown, stacked on a platter like kindling. At church potlucks, they were served at room temperature with a bowl of crema and another of salsa verde alongside for dipping. Making them for a crowd was repetitive work. Each tortilla had to be softened in hot oil before rolling, or it would crack and spill its filling into the fryer. The women who made flautas for 50 people did it in assembly lines, one softening, one filling, one rolling, one frying. When pre-made frozen taquitos appeared in grocery stores, the homemade version quietly lost its place at the table. Nobody said the frozen ones were better. They were just easier. Number 19. Nopalitos en escabeche. This is the one that divided every church table straight down the middle. Cactus paddles, sliced into thin strips, boiled until the slime cooked out, then marinated in vinegar with sliced onion, jalapeno, oregano, and a little olive oil. The texture was somewhere between a cooked green bean and a pickled okra, and people either loved it or refused to go near it. In parishes across the Southwest, the nopalitos were always placed at one end of the table, almost as a test. The older women who grew up gathering prickly pear from empty lots and vacant hillsides treated it like a staple. They had cleaned the thorns off with the back of a knife since they were children, and the idea that someone would find cactus exotic was beyond their understanding. The dish itself had roots that predated the border. Indigenous communities across northern Mexico and what is now Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona had eaten nopales for centuries before the Spanish arrived. In church settings, it served a practical purpose during Lent, when meat was not allowed on Fridays. A jar of nopalitos en escabeche could be prepared days in advance, kept cold, and served straight from the container. It needed no reheating and no last-minute work, which made it ideal for the chaos of a parish hall kitchen. What killed it at potlucks was not taste but perception. As Mexican-American families moved into suburbs and the children grew up shopping at chain grocery stores, cactus stopped appearing in the cart. The grandmothers who knew how to clean and prep it were not replaced by anyone willing to learn. A handful of Mexican grocery stores in South Texas and Southern California still sell the paddles fresh, and some families still bring nopalitos to church, but they are the exception now, not the rule. Number 18. Gorditas de harina. Thick flour tortillas, puffed and golden, split open like a pocket, and stuffed with whatever was on the table. The dough was simple: flour, lard, salt, and warm water, but the proportions had to be right or the gordita came out flat and dense instead of soft and pillowy. At church gatherings, the gorditas were fried in shallow oil until they puffed up, then stacked in a towel-lined basket. People filled them with guisados, beans, cheese, or whatever stew someone else had brought. They were the vehicle for everything. A good gordita held its filling without leaking, and the outside had a slight crunch that gave way to a tender, almost biscuit-like interior. When flour tortillas from the store became thin and uniform, the thick handmade gordita stopped making sense to a generation that had never shaped one. Number 17. Soaps. Small, thick rounds of masa pinched up at the edges to form a shallow cup, then topped with refried beans, shredded meat, lettuce, crema, and crumbled cheese. Each one was a complete meal the size of a fist. At potlucks, the soaps were arranged on trays in neat rows, already assembled, and people picked them up and ate them in 3 bites. The masa base was cooked on a comal first. Then the edges were pinched while the dough was still warm, which meant the cook needed hands that could take the heat. Making 100 soaps for a gathering was a test of patience and pain tolerance. The dish required too many steps for a modern kitchen on a Sunday morning, and when taco bars became the standard at parish events, the handmade soapy lost its audience. Number 16. Empanadas de calabaza. Small turnovers made from a sweet dough filled with a paste of cooked pumpkin, seasoned with cinnamon, piloncillo. The dough was rolled thin, cut into circles, filled, folded, and crimped with a fork before being fried or baked. In parishes across New Mexico and West Texas, these appeared at every fall gathering, still warm from the oven, with sugar dusted on top. The pumpkin filling had to be made from scratch, the calabaza boiled and mashed with the spices until it was smooth enough to hold inside the pastry without leaking. The anise was the signature. That faint licorice note in a bite of sweet pumpkin and fried dough was something children remembered decades after the last batch was made. Number 15. Enchiladas montadas. Flat corn tortillas stacked like pancakes with layers of cheese, onion, and a red or green chili sauce poured between each one, then topped with a fried egg. This was the West Texas and New Mexico way of making enchiladas, and it was nothing like the rolled version most Americans recognize. The stack sat on the plate like a small tower, and cutting into it with a fork sent sauce and melted cheese running in every direction. Making them for a crowd was simpler than rolling individual enchiladas because the tortillas laid flat and the assembly went quickly. In parish halls from Las Cruces to Amarillo, the montadas were a staple that nobody needed a recipe for. The proportions were done by eye, and the sauce was made from dried red chilies, soaked and blended. As rolled enchiladas with canned sauce became the default in home kitchens and restaurants, the flat stack lost its place. It never disappeared entirely in New Mexico, but outside that corridor, it is almost unknown today. Number 14. Mole poblano. If any single dish defined the ambition of a Mexican church potluck, it was mole. Not because it was the most popular or the most eaten, but because making it meant someone cared enough to spend days in a kitchen over a single sauce. The base started with dried chiles, mulato, ancho, pasilla, and chipotle, each one toasted separately on a comal until the skin blistered and the kitchen filled with a dark, smoky heat that stayed in the curtains for a week. Then came the chocolate. Not cocoa powder, but a disc of Mexican chocolate, gritty with sugar and cinnamon, melted into the sauce at the very end. Between the chiles and the chocolate, there were plantains, sesame seeds, peanuts, raisins, tomatoes, onion, garlic, stale tortilla pieces for body, and a handful of spices that varied from family to family and were never fully disclosed. Every ingredient was fried or toasted individually, then blended together and simmered for hours with turkey or chicken broth until the sauce turned the color of dark earth and tasted like nothing else in the world. The women who made mole for church events earned a status that was never spoken aloud but universally understood. Bringing a pot of real mole to the parish hall was the equivalent of putting your name on the line. If the sauce was too bitter, too sweet, too thin, or too gritty, everyone noticed and nobody said a word, which was worse than saying something. The mole recipe was often handed down from a mother or grandmother and adjusted over decades. Writing it down was considered unnecessary because the knowledge lived in the hands, not on paper. When the last woman in a family who knew the recipe passed away, the mole often went with her. Jars of store-bought mole paste appeared on shelves as a replacement, and they worked in a pinch. But anyone who had tasted the real thing from a church kitchen knew the difference on the first bite. Number 13. Lengua en salsa roja. Beef tongue braised for hours until the outer skin peeled away and the meat underneath was tender enough to slice with the side of a spoon. The slices were laid in a baking dish and covered with a red chili sauce made from guajillo peppers, tomato, and garlic. At church gatherings, the dish sat at the far end of the table. and the women who brought it never labeled what it was. Half the congregation ate it without asking and praised the tender beef. The other half found out later and swore they would never eat it again, then came back the following month and ate it anyway. Lengua was one of the cheapest cuts at the carniceria, which made it a natural choice for feeding a crowd on a budget. As Mexican-American families moved into neighborhoods with chain supermarkets that did not stock tongue, the dish lost its supply line before it lost its audience. Number 12. Arroz con leche. Rice pudding made by simmering white rice in milk with cinnamon sticks, sugar, and a strip of orange peel until the liquid reduced and the grains swelled into a thick, creamy mass. It was served cold in small cups or warm in bowls, depending on who made it and what the weather was doing. At church, potlucks it appeared alongside the heavier desserts, and people who claimed they were too full for anything else always found room for a cup of arroz con leche. The orange peel was the detail that separated the homemade version from everything else. That faint citrus note against the warm cinnamon and sweet milk was the flavor most people remembered years later when they thought about parish food. When instant pudding mixes replaced patience, the stovetop version stopped appearing. Number 11. Camotes enmielados. Sweet potatoes peeled and cut into thick rounds, then simmered in a syrup of piloncillo, cinnamon, and a few whole cloves until the flesh turned glassy and amber at the edges. They were served in shallow bowls with the syrup ladled over the top, and the sweetness was deep and earthy. Not the bright sugar of a store-bought candy, but the slow caramel of unrefined cane. At church gatherings, the camotes sat next to the other desserts and confused the children who expected them to taste like yams from a can. They did not. The piloncillo gave them a molasses note that made each bite taste older than it was, like something that had been cooked this way for centuries. And it had been. When canned yams with marshmallows became the standard at holiday tables, the original disappeared. Number 10. Chongos zamoranos. Curdled milk cooked slowly in a syrup of sugar and cinnamon until the curds firmed up into soft, sweet lumps that sat in the amber liquid like dumplings. The name came from Zamora, in Michoacan, and the recipe traveled north with families who settled in Texas and California. Making chongos required fresh whole milk and rennet tablets to start the curdling. Then hours of low heat to set the curds without breaking them apart. At potlucks, the dish arrived in deep glass bowls, the curds pale and the syrup dark, and people spooned them out carefully because a rough hand turned the whole thing to mush. Children either loved the texture or found it unsettling. There was no middle position. When ultra-pasteurized milk replaced the raw kind in most kitchens, the curdling became less reliable, and the dish quietly stopped showing up. Number 9. Barbacoa de cabeza, a whole cow head wrapped in maguey leaves and buried in a pit lined with hot coals, then covered with earth and left to cook overnight. By morning, the meat had steamed in its own juices for 8 or 10 hours, and every part of the head, the cheeks, the tongue, the lips, yielded meat so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork. This was the dish that defined Sunday morning in border towns from Brownsville to Nogales. At church potlucks, the barbacoa arrived shredded in deep aluminum pans, and it was always the first thing to run out. People ate it in warm flour tortillas with a squeeze of lime, a spoonful of salsa, and a few slices of raw onion. The flavor was unlike any other cut of beef because the cheek meat carried a richness that no steak could match, and the slow pit cooking gave it a faint smokiness that clung to the tortilla. Digging the pit was work. Maintaining the fire was work. Wrapping the head was work. It required an open lot, dry mesquite wood, heavy stones, and the kind of time that only existed when someone started on Saturday afternoon and did not plan to sleep. In some parishes, the barbacoa was a fundraiser, sold by the pound after morning mass, and the line stretched out the door and into the parking lot. As city ordinances restricted open-pit cooking, and families moved into subdivisions with homeowner associations that did not allow fire pits, the backyard barbacoa became impractical. Carnicerias insomni. Towns still sell it on weekends, steamed in commercial ovens instead of buried underground. But the people who remember the pit-cooked version say the difference is in the smoke, and once you take the earth out of the equation, something essential goes with it. Number 8. Moletes. A bolillo roll split in half, spread with refried beans, covered with a layer of shredded cheese, and broiled until the cheese bubbled and browned at the edges. It was the simplest thing on any potluck table, and one of the most fought over. The bread was the key. A proper bolillo had a hard crust and a soft interior that held up under the weight of the beans without turning soggy. At church gatherings, the mollets came out on sheet pans, still hot from the oven, and people grabbed them with napkins because no one wanted to wait for them to cool. Some women added a spoonful of pico de gallo on top. Others left them plain. The dish faded from parish tables not because it was difficult, but because the bakeries that made real bolillos closed one by one, and the supermarket version never had the right crust. Number 7. Chile colorado con carne. Chunks of beef simmered in a dark red sauce made from dried California and New Mexico chilies that had been soaked in hot water and blended until smooth. The sauce was thick, almost like a gravy, and it coated the meat in a layer that deepened in color the longer it sat. This was celebration food in parts of Arizona and Sonora, the kind of dish that took a morning to prepare and filled a kitchen with a warm, earthy heat that was not so much spicy as it was persistent. At potlucks, it sat beside the rice and the beans, and people ladled it generously because the sauce was as important as the meat. The dish needed a specific type of dried pepper that most modern grocery stores do not stock, and without those chilies, the color and the flavor both fall short of what the recipe demands. Number 6. Tres leches. A sponge cake soaked in 3 kinds of milk, evaporated, condensed, and heavy cream, until the crumb absorbed so much liquid it trembled on the plate like a custard. At church celebrations after baptisms and quinceañeras, the tres leches cake was the centerpiece of the dessert table, decorated with whipped cream and sometimes a sprinkle of cinnamon on top. The cake had to be baked light and airy, or it collapsed under the weight of all that milk. Making it for a crowd meant baking multiple sheet pans and soaking each one overnight in the refrigerator. The women who did it well guarded their ratios. Too much condensed milk and the cake turned cloyingly sweet. Too much cream and it went heavy. The balance was learned by repetition and rarely written down. Bakery versions replaced the homemade ones over time, and the difference showed in every bite. Number 5. Enfrioladas. Corn tortillas dipped in a smooth black or pinto bean sauce, folded, and arranged in a dish with crumbled cheese, sliced onion, and a drizzle of crema on top. They looked like enchiladas, but the sauce was beans, not chile, and the flavor was milder, earthier, and deeply satisfying in a way that nobody could explain by listing the ingredients. At Lenten potlucks, they filled the gap left by the absence of meat dishes. The bean sauce had to be blended until it was perfectly smooth and seasoned with a little epazote or cumin. Lumpy sauce meant the tortillas did not coat evenly, and the whole dish looked messy on the plate. The women who made enfrijoladas well took pride in the smoothness of that sauce above everything else. The dish disappeared as bean-based main courses fell out of fashion with a generation raised on drive-through windows. Number 4. Birria de res. Beef shank and short ribs braised in a sauce of guajillo, ancho, and morita chilies, with cumin, oregano, cloves, and a bay leaf. The meat cooked in a sealed pot for hours until the broth turned red and the beef shredded at the touch. At church gatherings in Jalisco descended communities from Los Angeles to Houston, birria was served in deep bowls with diced onion, cilantro, and lime on the side, alongside warm corn tortillas for dipping into the consommé. The broth was the prize. People drank it straight from the bowl after the meat was gone, because the fat and the chile and the slow-cooked gelatin from the bones made a liquid that warmed from the inside out. When birria went mainstream as a taco trend in recent years, the church potluck version, patient and unadorned, had already been gone from most parish tables for a generation. Number 3. Atole. A thick warm drink made from masa harina dissolved in water or milk, sweetened with sugar or piloncillo, and flavored with vanilla or cinnamon. It was thinner than champurrado and lighter in color, and it served the same purpose at church events. Something warm to hold in your hands on a cold morning after Mass. The masa gave it a starchy body that coated your mouth and settled in your stomach like a small meal. In some parishes, atole was flavored with strawberry or guava, and the pink or orange color in the foam cups made it look festive against the beige of the tamale table. Children drank it without knowing what was in it and assumed it was some kind of thick, hot chocolate. The corn taste was the whole identity, and the generation that grew up on instant cocoa packets never learned to appreciate it. Number 2. Chilaquiles rojos, stale corn tortillas cut into triangles, fried until crisp, then tossed in a red salsa made from tomatoes and dried chilies until the chips softened just enough to bend without snapping. Topped with crema, crumbled queso fresco, and sliced onion, sometimes with a fried egg laid on top for the early morning gatherings. At parish breakfasts after sunrise Mass, the chilaquiles were served from a deep skillet, and people argued about how soft the chips should be. Some wanted them still crunchy in the center. Others wanted them soaked through and tender. The cook decided, and nobody challenged her in her own kitchen. The dish faded from church tables when breakfast potlucks themselves became rare, replaced by coffee and store-bought pastries laid out on a folding table with no ceremony at all. Number 1. The tamalada. This was not a single dish. It was an event. The tamalada was a gathering of women, sometimes 6, sometimes 20, who came together in a church kitchen or a family home to make tamales by the hundreds. The masa was spread on corn husks. The filling, pork in red chili, chicken in green salsa, rajas with cheese, went in the center. The husks were folded, stacked in tall pots, and steamed for hours while the women talked and laughed and argued about whose technique was better. Children ran in and out stealing spoonfuls of masa. These tamales were sold by the dozen to raise money for the parish, given away at Christmas, and brought to every potluck as the anchor of the table. The tamalada itself, the act of women gathering to cook together for their community, is what disappeared first. The tamales you can still buy from a neighbor. The room full of women spreading masa side by side on a Saturday morning. That is the part almost no one has anymore. That parking lot, those folding tables, the foil peeled back from a pan somebody drove across town with balanced on their lap. None of it was fancy. All of it mattered. If any of these dishes brought back a memory of your own church, your own family, or a woman whose cooking you will never taste again, leave her name in the comments. Share this with someone who remembers. And if you have not already, hit subscribe so you never miss another one of these. This is The Hungry Mexican. We remember so you do not have to do it alone.